Welcome back to the Anti-Meta Meta Club. This week's Race C is actually another copy and paste combo, but it's one of my favorite combos ever. The last anti-meta car still works, but I wanted to give you another option, so let's get into it. The anti-meta car of the week is the Genesis X. Despite the fact that it's actually all over the top 10, when it comes to the actual race itself, the Porsche dominates. While the Porsche's tire wear isn't that much better than the Genesis, it handles it a lot better, making it a lot easier to keep up your pace even when the tires are going off. The Jenny is still very powerful and nimble enough that you can defend against the Porsche and even pull off a pass. As you've probably seen, the Genesis is actually very fast when it comes to time trial, but it's the actual race pace that really wins races, and that's what matters in this case. There are multiple examples of the Genesis in the top 10 and all over the top 100. I managed to get it in 19th place, and there's a lot more pace left over. Slayers initially gave me a tune, and I kind of adapted it with our buddy Roadbeef. Roadbeef helped me change a few settings to make it a little bit easier for me to drive, and I do like this better than what I was using before. Don't forget to screenshot this or take a picture of it, something like that, because you've got to put it on at the beginning of every race. An important thing to remember on this track, both forwards and back, is these two little kinks right here on the front straight. You do not need to take those wide, just hug both of those. As we approach the first braking zone, you're going to notice this green bollard here on the right, followed by a yellow part of the barrier just beyond that. At that barrier is when you're going to start turning in. Gently lift off the throttle as you turn in, looking for these double green bollards, and right as you pass them, you're going to start applying just a little bit of brakes to scrub off some speed before hitting the brakes fully at the 100 meter board. Brake fully and go up on this curb, aligning yourself with the left side of the track, and then turn in when you get to the marshals on the left. Continue braking heavily as you start to turn in. If you start understeering, that's when you want to come off the brakes until you come off them entirely, pop up to second gear, make sure you're right next to that apex, and then get on the throttle as soon as you possibly can. You want to make sure you don't slide whatsoever because you'll lose a ton of time if you do. As we're going on this long straight, it's important to note that the optimal shifting point for this car is around 90 to 95% of the digital tachometer there in the center of the screen. As you know, you want to steer as little as possible. Instead of trying to follow the curve of the road, you just want to go as straight as you possibly can. The very beginning of the red and white curb is where you want to brake, but if you look deeper down towards the end of the red and white curb, you can see that there's kind of a kink and it straightens out. You want to aim to line up with where it straightens out towards the very end of it. In this way, you can brake while starting off the curb and then move onto the curb after you start braking. You'll also notice these tire marks, which indicate exactly when you want to turn in. Turn in second gear, pop it to first as you're coming off the brakes, and then back up to second gear as you apex and gently get back on the throttle. You do not want any oversteer here. That's going to be disastrous. I like second gear to exit there, but third gear does work if you've kept up enough momentum through the corner. Once again, we can see the tire marks, which kind of guide us. You want to be turning in before the end of the curve. Approximately when you get to the BBS sign on the right, that's when you want to start lifting off the throttle, but you don't want to come entirely off the throttle. You just want to lift off enough that the front end starts turning in as you add more steering. Don't be afraid to use the curb, and fourth gear before full throttle can help you stop any kind of wheel spin before it starts. Aiming slightly left after we clear that last part of the curb, you're going to aim for just about the middle of the track and turn in right before you get to the BBS sign on the right. Notice that I'm lifting off the throttle just gradually to tighten up the corner to make sure I can use as much of the track without my left tires going over the white line. Brake as soon as you get into the tunnel and aim for that chevron there in the distance. Immediately downshift to second and trail brake in, downshifting to first once you get all the way to the apex. I want you to notice that I let the car roll as I add more steering, and right as the last chevron in the distance appears is when I start adding more throttle in third gear. In order to avoid understeer, you should have steered as much as you possibly could without sliding the tires before getting on the throttle, and then you unwind the steering wheel as you add more throttle. You should be able to add full throttle just briefly before you get all the way to the outside of the track right next to the wall. Of course, you want to use as much of it as you can, including the curb, and we're going to brake right before we get to the outside of the tunnel. The trick is to brake sharply but briefly and start turning in as soon as you start trail braking. It should be a very quick process. As soon as you apex, continue steering left and add as much throttle as you can without sliding at all. Once the front of your car is pointing fully to the left of the next curb, then you can start changing direction. After changing directions, you're going to lift just enough to get as close to the sausage curbs on the inside of the corner as you can without touching them whatsoever. Again, throttle as much as you can without sliding the car and continue turning right until we get to the point that we're entirely past this fence here beyond the barrier, and then you're going to switch directions again. Once again, after the car has fully shifted its weight and you're leaning all the way into the curve, you can then lift off the throttle just enough to make sure you use as much of that curb as you can without going into the grass. For this final right-hander, you want to stay full throttle and you want the car shifted to the right before you go over that curb. If you hit that weird, you can go all the way into this wall and it kind of juts out, which will definitely end your lap. You may also notice that the front end gets a little light. Make sure you continue steering to the right. You're going to be very brave as you go to the last braking zone. Right at the 50-meter board is when you're going to hit the brakes. Going to full brake only briefly as you turn in, you want to start trail braking in second gear, aiming to be in first gear before you get to this other colored portion of the track right here. You want to get all the way to the apex, up to third gear, and I actually like to apex right before the end of that colored section, but unfortunately I hit a little bit early, which caused me to have to use a little bit of throttle rotation, which did cost me a little bit of time, but it wasn't enough to end the lap, and it was my fastest lap of the day. You could probably stay in fourth gear, but I did decide to shift to fifth. Like I mentioned in the breakdown, you want to make sure that you're not going super wide for these two right-hand kinks on the front straight. You can stay really close to them, and of course make sure that you're shifting between 90 and 95% of the digital tachometer. This car understeers quite a lot. Make sure that you're braking really heavily and using the downshifting, using the compression braking to get the car slowing down. If you find that you're understeering or sliding past that first corner, you're probably still just carrying too much speed. It's going to feel like you're almost stopping the car, but the car can rotate at the very end and it has such good, incredible acceleration that it doesn't even matter if you do stop. You're probably still going to be faster than most of the other cars on the straight. Braking on the curbs can make the ABS feel kind of weird, but if you brake before you go on the curbs and then move onto it afterwards, it seems to kind of alleviate some of those weird things that it does. I mentioned before that I do like second gear for that corner. I think some of the really fast guys are probably rotating a lot faster than I do and then exiting in third gear. When you steer a lot before adding the throttle, you do have the option to then unwind the steering wheel before it becomes a problem. That's kind of how I treat really slippery cars in any kind of situation, and it definitely helps with this car as well. If you find yourself hitting the wall right here before the braking zone, you're probably either glancing off that curb and kind of bouncing, or you're actually not steering enough. There's also a chance that you're not turning in early enough or late enough. It's a weird one. The timing's really difficult, but just make sure that you're using as much of that curb as you can. This race is actually a copy and paste job from one of the races we had, I believe, just 2 months ago, which is, I think, exactly what happened last week. While there weren't any other options for an anti-meta car last week, this time there are a few different options, so I decided to make another guide with just another one of the cars. The same car that we used last time does still work, so I'm going to link that in the comments, and if I remember, I'm going to put a link here so you can just click it from the video. But anyways, the Genesis, as you've seen, is all over the top 10 and the top 100, but like I mentioned earlier, it's nowhere near as good as the Porsche when it comes to the actual race pace, partially because of exactly what happens when the tires die. I did mention that the Porsche seems to also have some pretty high tire wear, but the Porsche itself does not seem to handle the same way as the Genesis when it comes to the bad tire wear. The Porsche seems to be able to maintain its pace for a lot longer than the Genesis. Either that or the Genesis is just much, much harder, but as you can see from the very beginning of the race, this is the reason that we chose the Genesis as the anti-meta car, and it's also the reason why it's so good in the leaderboards on the time trial. The Jenny has massive acceleration, which the Porsche also has, but it also has higher top speed, and it does have more of that acceleration. It does lack in grip, but if you drive it right and you've got a good enough tune, you can kind of equalize that. Now, this is unfortunately one of those races where not a lot of the top split guys were driving, so there is a lot of clumsiness. And in that, you don't really get to see what this car can do exactly next to a Porsche of a similar driver's pace. But you can definitely see what happens in the middle of traffic, and most of you are going to be experiencing a lot of the different traffic, so you've got to know how to handle it. Strategy-wise, if you're starting from the front, you can definitely start on the mediums and then transition to the hards, but it's going to be better overall if you start on the hards just because of the nature of how light the car gets. Anyways, you can see that I started on the hards, and it looks like most other people did too, and that might be the reason there is so much absolute chaos going on in this race. I think you can probably agree that what I went through there was pretty much unavoidable. Unless I just stomped on my brakes, then of course I'd be liable for anything that happened behind me, so I just tried to push through and avoid as many people as possible, but because of the automated penalty system, I ended up with 3 full seconds. Inevitably, you're going to end up in lobbies like this at some point during your sim racing career, so I was hoping that how I navigated could potentially help some of you guys. Even though I got a 3-second penalty, I don't think any of it was my fault, and I think I was just a victim of the penalty system, so hopefully you can see what strategies I used to avoid most of the mess, but if not, at least it was probably fun to watch. A smarter move would have probably been to not go for a pass here, maybe even bump draft him, but I wasn't quite sure if a late bump draft would actually help him, and I also wanted to see if I could pass pretty easily going into T1, which it looks like I could. Now that we have to serve a massive penalty, we can start talking about the strategy. Like I said before, you could start on the softer compound, but at the beginning of a race, you're going to have a lot of fuel weight, and you're probably going to end up destroying your softer tires. I say softer because it's not soft tires. They're the medium compound with hards available. But anyways, if you start in the softer compound, you could potentially mess up your tires pretty early, especially because of the fuel weight. But if you start on the harder compound, they're going to be a lot more resilient to that fuel weight. You're probably going to lose a lot less of the tire life doing that. In doing so, you're making it so your softer compound will be on your second stint, when your car is going to weigh less because of fuel weight, and you're going to be able to make it last longer because of that. I really like to wait until lap 6 to pit, but if I were starting on the softer compound, I would probably do the exact same thing. The front tires are going to be really sensitive to being destroyed, and this is a twisty track. You're probably going to have traffic, so those front tires are going to get really easily destroyed. So if you do start with a softer compound up front, you're most likely going to destroy them really quickly. So that's why you're going to end up with the same stint length, regardless of which tire compound you choose to use at the beginning. If you look at the track map at the top right, you can notice that our friend Super Chicken is leading the race. Now, Super Chicken is a top split driver. He is a very fast driver. He's had world records. He has competed at the Porsche Esports Championship, the United States version of it, twice, 2 years in a row. So he's a very fast driver. He is in the Porsche in this race. And so when you've got a driver like that in the meta car and you're starting from the back, there's pretty much nothing that you can do. But if you look very closely behind him, just one corner behind him, maybe a couple seconds, is Phil Duff, and I want you to pay attention to his position right there for the end of the race. I do want to address the contact that I made with the guy in T1. I believe he just lost the car as he was trying to navigate the corner. He got himself a little sideways, making him turn into me just a little bit, but because of the fact that neither of us actually spun out and I didn't do anything that would make me go and hit him, I tried to stay to the inside and I didn't try to just drive straight through him. I decided to continue going. I didn't get any upset messages from him. I wasn't upset with him. I just thought it was a racing incident, so I just continued. But if you think otherwise, feel free to say so in the comments. Now that we're actually catching traffic again after serving that 3-second penalty, it's important to start talking about what you can do to make and set up overtakes. The Porsche is the most popular car by far when it comes to people who sign up for manufacturers, and I believe it's the most popular car used in all of the daily races as well. And I think one of the reasons that is that if you mess up in the entry or even the middle of a corner, you can still get a really good exit with the Porsche, and it has such incredible acceleration that it can kind of mask any kind of mistakes, and in the hands of a really good driver, then of course you've got yourself an absolute weapon in the Porsche. The weakness lies in the difficulty to navigate it around really tight corners, switching back, and of course the top speed. As long as you get a really good run and you've got the slipstream from the Porsche, even if the Porsche has slipstream, you should be able to get in front of it by the end of either of the full throttle sections on this track. Despite how well the Porsche handles and how understeering this giant boat of a car the Genesis is, you can still pull off a clean pass on anyone as long as you set it up correctly. The other main benefit of using a hard tire first strategy is that your first stint is definitely going to be shorter than a short stint from another driver. And even though I like to go on a short stint, even if I do use the medium tires first, most people are not. Most people are trying to use their softer tires as long as they can. And that means if you pit early enough with the hard tires, you're going to have yourself a lot of clean air. If you're racing someone who is one position ahead of you and who chooses to use a medium compound first, you're most likely going to come into the pits at least a lap or two before them, and you're going to have your 2 fastest laps when they have their 2 slowest laps of their medium stint. If your outlaps are fast enough and they're within just a couple seconds ahead of you, you should be able to pass them without actually seeing them on track. One final word on why the Genesis is actually a really good choice against all of the really nicely handling mid-engine cars is that the mid-engine cars come with a huge talent cost. You really need to practice a lot and have a good understanding of car physics and how the cars work to really get the most out of the mid-engine car. So if you're not super confident, then this car can be a really good safe choice for you. As you can see, that Lamborghini, which is actually a very fast car here, went all the way past the apex, rotated a little bit too much, and then lost momentum right as I was able to pull off a little bit of a switcheroo, and we were all the way in front of him. There's no way a Lamborghini is ever going to be able to pass any of the Genesis on the straight. Whatever you call the Genesis, plural. I always do this whenever I have the Genesis. I didn't do it last week, but almost every other time. I don't know how to say Genesises, and it sounds funny. If you watched the last guide for this exact same race, you'll know that the Corvette was the anti-meta car last time, and as we get on the straight, you're going to see exactly why it was so powerful here, or it is so powerful here. Now you're going to see that he got a better exit than I did. I got a little bit of oversteer, my exit was a little bit tighter, but it shouldn't have made that much of a difference. The Corvette is really just that powerful. Despite the fact that I'm in its slipstream, I haven't gotten that much closer to it, and considering the fact that the Genesis is considered one of the very most powerful cars in the class, it's really crazy that the Corvette can still pull away from it, and I wasn't able to get next to him until this next braking zone. You can pretty much count on people to defend on the inside in sim racing most of the time because, one, you can't really trust people that you don't know, and two, defending on the inside is usually the better way to go. Now, if you can trust the person to not punt you off on the outside, then you can carry more speed, of course, but you can also just brake later, and depending on where they go, you could just pull off a good old switcheroo. I was planning on doing the switcheroo on that guy, but he maintained the inside line, so I just kind of hoped that he would give me space, and he did, so shout out to that guy. I don't think I've ever raced him before, and he gave me just enough space to keep it clean while still giving me a run for my money. So again, shout out to that guy. Since I did pit a little bit earlier than other people, I did have the risk of potentially coming out in traffic, but luckily I did have clean air as I had hoped to have. You can see that it appears that I lost some positions, but what really happened is that the people who are suddenly in front of me just have not cleared the full pit cycle just yet. Jumping forward to the very next lap, you can see that I've now recovered 3 of those positions, and I've also caught Weedy, who is coming out of the pits after finishing his pit cycle. Coming out of the pits can be really tough trying to find your braking position, and because of that, I think he lost a little bit of time, but either way, we're going to be behind him going into this last straight, and I think we're going to get in front of him no matter what. Even if he had slipped from that Beetle, the Genesis should be able to use the slingshot after being behind him and then get all the way in front, so it's a pretty easy pass going into this. It's also really important to pay attention to people that you know you've passed and you know have not gone through the pit cycle. I knew that Groby, I believe, was in the last position in the race. We had already passed him before the pit cycle, and so seeing him now meant that he just hasn't gone to the pits yet, and we're going to have to be really aggressive to make sure that he doesn't slow us down. It was always a possibility that Weedy could stick with us and then try to pull off a move or at least slow us down by battling us a lot, so being able to put Groby between myself and Weedy was really huge. If you know that someone still has to go through the pit cycle, you can be a little bit more aggressive and decide not to wait for an overtake because they're going to have to go in the pit, so it doesn't really matter if you're in front or behind them unless they're going to slow you down, in which case you definitely want to be in front of them. Like I said before, passing Super Chicken was never going to be an option, which meant that only Phil Duff and Leonardo were the people in front of us, and I had already passed Leonardo twice in this race, so I knew that he still had to go for the pits, and him only being 7 seconds ahead meant that I wasn't going to even have to see him. I was going to pass him while he was in the pits. It wasn't until lap 11 that Phil Duff decided to pit. Actually, I think he was at the end of his lap 10 coming out on lap 11. But either way, we're all the way in front of Leonardo as we'd predicted, but I didn't quite know what to expect with Phil. Luckily, he did do his softer compound first, and he made it last an incredibly long time. Despite the fact that he probably lost some time on the last few laps of that stint, he was far enough ahead that it really didn't matter. If Super Chicken and I weren't here, he would have won this race decidedly. With Phil now only 3 seconds ahead after coming out of the pit something like 4 seconds ahead, and I had just set my fastest lap of a 25.7, this car can go faster than that, by the way, it did seem likely that I was going to be able to catch Phil. I had not ever raced him before, though, so I wasn't sure if he was going to be clean, and so it was kind of a mystery as to what was going to happen with the rest of the race. By the end of the penultimate lap, I had fully caught our friend Phil. Now, Phil immediately went to defend as I went to potentially pass him going into the final corner, which of course is exactly what he should do, but it was pretty much inevitable that I was going to be able to pass him. Like I'd said earlier, I'd never passed or raced Phil before, so I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, and this is not at all an indictment of Phil himself. This is more so a commentary on sim racing in general, and specifically Gran Turismo, because Gran Turismo's penalty system can very easily be manipulated, and you can find people in the top split who don't deserve it. This guy Phil, however, seems to very much deserve it. He's still attacking, but he's doing so very cleanly, and I ended up having a very fun race with him. So shout out to Phil, shout out to the other guys who gave me a clean race. Despite the fact that this was chaotic at the beginning, everyone that I raced ended up giving me space, so I had a really, really good experience, and these are people I'd never raced with before. It's really rare, especially at this time. I believe it was 10:30 p.m. in my time zone, which made it, I believe, 1:30 a.m. on the East Coast. These people were up late, and it was really cool to find really good racers at this time of night. So shout out to all those guys that I had this race with. This was a really fun one, and I do think I did get to showcase what the Genesis can do against the Metacars. Now, I have to admit, because of the dominance of the Porsche, I have raced and beat Porsches in the top split during the actual peak hours, but if you took two drivers who were of equal skill, and you put one in the Porsche and one in the Genesis, the Porsche is going to win. Unfortunately, the Porsche is incredibly powerful, but you never know what you can do with some luck, and with a lot of extra practice, you may be able to rise above your level. And the anti-meta isn't always about winning, it's about fighting the meta. So I'm really glad that we do have multiple options, the Corvette, the Genesis, and others to fight the meta. And of course, congratulations to Super Chicken for beating us all by 19 seconds. I started in, I think, 14th or 15th, something like that. But Phil started in second, and Super Chicken still beat us by 19 seconds. Crazy. Thank you for watching my video. If you liked what you saw, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, I'll be making another one of these guides every single week. To finish off the video, I'm going to leave you with a look at my current members. I love every single one of you guys. Thank you very much.